This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The Suez and Panama Canals. The Suez Canal in Egypt and the Panama Canal in Panama are both vital to global trade today. The Suez Canal is a 120-mile canal in the Middle East. It links the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. This allows ships traveling between Europe and Asia to avoid going all the way around Africa. The Panama Canal, on the other hand, is a 48-mile wide canal in Central America. It connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. This in turn permits ships traveling between the Americas and Asia to avoid going all the way around South America. Together, the Suez and Panama Canals save a great deal of time and shipping cost. The Suez and Panama Canals were constructed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, this is a time of incredible transportation improvements. A good example of this is with railroads. For instance, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States that linked the East and West Coast in 1869, as well as the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia, completed in 1916, that linked the Pacific Ocean with the European side of Russia. Canals were also important to transportation improvements in the late 19th and 20th century. And canals were also part of Western imperialism, technological and medical improvements, and an overall strengthening of the human web in this time period. Now, this video will discuss both the Suez and Panama Canals, and will draw some connections between both of them. So first, the Suez Canal. International trade passed from the Mediterranean Sea through the Isthmus of Suez as far back as the Roman Empire, when the Romans traded with India and China via the Isthmus of Suez through the Red Sea. Plans to build a canal through the Isthmus of Suez to create an actual waterway linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas had been contemplated since ancient times. However, it was only when French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, who lived from 1805 to 1894, pushed for an actual canal in the Suez, that real progress was made. Lesseps, who was a diplomat that had represented France and Egypt, obtained an agreement from the Ottoman government of Egypt to construct the Suez Canal in 1854. Now, Egypt had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire since 1517. Nonetheless, by the 19th century, Ottoman control of Egypt was largely nominal. In 1805, military leader Muhammad Ali took control of Egypt and came to hold the real power there. Muhammad Ali established a new dynasty of rulers that was very interested in modernizing Egypt's military as well as its economy. So naturally, the government of Egypt was very interested in the Suez Canal and gave approval for Lesseps to begin construction there. Actual construction began on the Suez Canal in 1859. And this was a massive project that involved tens of thousands of workers. The work was done with machines such as steam shovels that removed desert sand to allow for the canal. Now, conditions for workers were very harsh, and at one point there was a cholera epidemic that killed thousands of workers. Nonetheless, the Suez Canal was finally finished in 1869. With further work to widen and develop it and permit more ships to go through begun in 1876. The opening of the Suez Canal had a rapid and dramatic impact on world trade as well as events, including the facilitation of European imperialism. The Suez Canal allowed European ships to travel much quickly to Asia. This in turn strengthened British connections to India, its most important colony or the crown jewel in the British Empire. The Suez Canal also further opened China to European interference in trade. Likewise, the Suez Canal made it easier for the French in 1887 to make Indochina, what we now call Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a French colony. Finally, the Suez Canal made the European conquest of Africa, also known as the Scramble for Africa, much easier. Now, the scramble for Africa is generally thought to have begun in 1884 and 1885 with the Berlin Conference. Nonetheless, the construction of the Suez Canal was an important precursor to this scramble for Africa. When the Suez Canal first opened in 1869, it was first run by the Suez Canal Company, a French company that issued stock. Now, some of the stock was owned by the French, and much of it was owned by the Egyptian government itself. But the Suez Canal and the subsequent improvements on the canal were very expensive. There was a great deal of overspending that put the Egyptian government deeply in debt. In 1875, the Egyptian government was so far in debt it was almost bankrupt. It decided to sell its shares in the Suez Canal Company to alleviate its financial problems. The British, in turn, by this time, increasingly saw the Suez Canal as a strategic canal to its colony of India. And therefore, the British government decided to buy the Egyptian government's share in the Suez Canal Company. And this gave the British a 44% share of the Suez Canal Company, the largest percentage of any nation. Shortly afterwards, in 1882, the Egyptian army came to be controlled by an anti-European leader named Arabi Pasha. Pasha's control of the Egyptian army, along with an anti-European riot in Alexandria, greatly alarmed the British, who feared they might even lose control of the Suez Canal Company. The British Navy, therefore, was sent in and shelled the city of Alexandria and captured Arabi Pasha. The British then occupied all of Egypt and made it a British protectorate. After the First World War, things began to change. And in 1936, with the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, the British gave Egypt its independence. But they retained control of their shares of the Suez Canal Company, giving them a great financial control over the canal itself. The British also stationed a number of troops in the Suez Canal zone. And this was a very large zone. It was about 16 times the size of Bartow County. As late as 1954, the British had 80,000 troops there, although most of those were pulled out shortly thereafter. Now, British control over the Suez Canal Company through the ownership of about 44% of the shares of the company was unacceptable to the Egyptian government. By the 1950s, the Egyptian government was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was a major advocate of Arab nationalism and independence. In July 1956, Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, and that meant the Egyptian government forcibly took over ownership of it. And this was a move that outraged the British, as well as the French governments. In November 1956, the British, French, and Israelis, who were enemies of Egypt, decided to invade Egypt and reestablish their control over the Suez Canal. Egyptian forces did poorly against the British, French, and Israelis, but the conflict over the Suez Canal greatly alarmed the United States. The United States was afraid that conflict in the Suez would strain relations between the Arab world and the West, and that it would further exacerbate the Cold War and maybe even lead to a conflict with the Soviet Union. As a result of this, American President Dwight Eisenhower ordered the British to withdraw from Egypt. And he threatened to sell British bonds and ruin the British financially if they did not comply. Britain, followed by France and then Israel, did withdraw from Egypt. Now, this was a humiliating episode for the British. And the 1956 Suez Crisis was a decisive moment in the decline of the British and French empires. Now, since 1956, the Suez Canal has been under the control of the Egyptian government and is still a major artery of world trade. Well, moving on to the Panama Canal, for its part, the Isthmus of Panama was first traversed by Europeans in 1513 with the Spanish expedition led by Vasco de Balboa. And this was the first European expedition to actually reach the Pacific Ocean. In the centuries following Balboa, the Isthmus of Panama served as a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And there had been much speculation about a canal there as well. Panama became a province of Colombia after that nation won its independence from Spain in 1819. French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps made the first real attempt to build a canal in Panama. As we've seen, Lesseps was famous for his role in building the Suez Canal. After the Suez Canal was completed, Lesseps organized a new company, the Panama Canal Company, to build the Panama Canal, and construction began in Panama in 1881. Unfortunately, Lesseps ran into many difficulties in Panama. Unlike in the Suez, where the soil consists of soft sand, Panama's terrain was hilly and its soil was very rocky. This made digging difficult. To make matters worse, digging during the rainy season led to massive landslides along the Panama Canal. Also, Lesseps attempted to build the Panama Canal at sea level, the same as he had built in the Suez. But the terrain in Panama made that very impractical. Worse yet, the tropical jungles of Panama were full of mosquitoes, which spread malaria and yellow fever, diseases that killed about 22,000 workers, or 500 for every mile that Lesseps actually managed to build. Between all of these construction difficulties and malaria, as well as financial mismanagement, the Panama Canal Company went bankrupt in 1889. And this led to a great scandal in France and the halt of construction there. Now, in the late 19th and 20th centuries, the United States was a rising imperial power, especially in Latin America and the Pacific. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had fought in the Spanish-American War in 1898, was especially aggressive and imperialistic, and was known for his slogan, "Speak softly but carry a big stick," for his views on the use of military force. In 1902, while Theodore Roosevelt was president, the U.S. Congress purchased the remaining shares of the French Panama Canal Company, giving the United States a claim to Panama and the canal that was unfinished there. The following year, in 1903, the United States signed the Hay-Haran Treaty, in which Colombia gave control of Panama, the Panama Zone, to the United States for $10 million. While the Colombian government signed this agreement, the Colombian Senate refused to ratify the treaty. When Roosevelt heard about this, he was infuriated, remarking that, quote, "I do not think that the Bogota lot of jackrabbits should be permitted to bar one of the future highways of civilization." And this shows Roosevelt's low view of Colombian politicians. A revolt for independence in Panama shortly after this episode convinced Roosevelt that Colombia had misgoverned and misruled Panama in his views, which justified sending in the U.S. Navy. Now, the justification for the U.S. Navy was a bit flimsy. The reality was that Panama was really not a nation and was a province of Colombia. But the United States wanted its independence, and with the U.S. Navy being sent in, independence was granted by the nation of Colombia. As part of all this, a new treaty was signed, the Hay-Buena-Varela Treaty. And this gave the United States control of a 10-mile strip of land in Panama on which to finish the canal. And between 1904 and 1914, the Americans renewed the construction of the Panama Canal. And this was also a massive project with tens of thousands of workers brought to Panama. And many were of African descent, workers from the British West Indies, islands such as Jamaica and the Barbados. Many of these workers would later settle in Panama, adding to the nation's racial diversity. While over 5,600 workers died of diseases such as malaria and yellow fever during the American phase of construction, due to the work of a Cuban doctor, Carlos Finlay, and an American doctor, Walter Reed, the impact of disease was much less on these workers. Also, the Americans were very aggressive in fumigating and in draining water near the Panama Canal Zone, and that greatly reduced the mosquito population and thus the spread of diseases. American engineers also decided in their construction that the Panama Canal needed locks to accommodate Panama's hilly geography. And this was a very important feature, adding locks to the Panama Canal. The Americans made extensive use of a new technology, dynamite, to blast away layers of rock and soil. And this made it easier to build the canal itself. Likewise, they used huge machinery such as steam shovels, cranes, rock crushers, drills, and dredgers to continue their work on the canal. The soil removed in the construction of the canal was used to build a big causeway into the ocean that is today outside of Panama City. Now, the Americans did finish the work on the Panama Canal, and the canal was first opened on August 15, 1914, just a few weeks after the beginning of the First World War. The United States stationed troops in the Panama Canal Zone and maintained a great deal of control over the country of Panama. Panamanians resented this, noting especially America's role in backing Egypt's control of the Suez Canal in the 1956 Suez crisis. It seemed a bit hypocritical for America to back Egypt taking control of the Suez Canal in 1956 while America retained control of the Panama Canal. And this led to a great deal of discontent in Panama, particularly in the early 1960s, culminating in a violent group of protests in Panama in 1964. As a result of all this, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, American presidents such as Lyndon B. Johnson and Gerald Ford began considering handing over the Panama Canal back to the country of Panama. However, it was only in 1977 that President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty with Panama, the Torrijos-Carter treaties, that did just that. Carter believed that giving the Panama Canal to Panama was the right thing to do, noting in his speech to the nation about his decision that it had bipartisan support. Carter also pointed out that the Panama Canal would remain neutral and open to global trade, including American trade. After Carter left office in 1981, America still retained close interest in Panama. But beginning in 1983, Panamanian military leader Manuel Noriega took more and more control over the Panamanian government. Noriega violently oppressed political opponents, and he refused to recognize the results of an election in May 1989 that elected a candidate that he did not like. Noriega was also accused of drug running. Because of all of this, on December 20th, 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered 27,000 American troops to invade Panama. After about 2 weeks of fighting and several hundred civilian deaths, U.S. forces captured Noriega. In the aftermath of his removal from power, democracy was restored to Panama. And on December 31st, 1999, the Panama Canal was formally returned to the nation of Panama. From 2007 into 2015, the Panamanians greatly expanded the canal, adding a new lane for ships and doubling the shipping capacity of the canal. The Panama Canal is now a vital avenue of global trade, especially between the United States and Asia. Its recent expansion has also had a big impact on Georgia, leading to the expansion of the Port of Savannah and the creation of internal railroad ports even here in northwest Georgia. Today, over 400,000 jobs in Georgia are connected to the Port of Savannah, which is in turn connected to global trade, and most of it passes through the Panama Canal. So let's draw some conclusions. Both the Suez and Panama Canals came about because of Western imperialism and technological and medical improvements in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Suez and Panama Canals were linked in other ways as well. First, because of the way they were begun with construction, they were both linked to French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps. And through the respective nations' resistance to imperialisms and assertions of national independence, they are also linked to resistance of imperialism. Since their constructions, they have been vital to global trade and in closer connections of the human web, and they will likely remain so in the future. I'll stop with that observation. Thanks for watching.